So in chapter 9, we're going to learn all about how culture influences our emotions. There are four major topics we're going to cover in this chapter. The first one is the evolution of human emotion. We're going to start with this idea that emotions are a way of learning and understanding the world. We'll also learn about some terminology specific to psychology, the distinction between an emotional experience versus emotional expression. Experience is basically what you're feeling on the inside. Expression is what you're showing to the world on the outside via your nonverbal body language and your facial expression. We'll also talk about research on EQ, or emotional intelligence, the idea that our ability to manage and control our emotions, in addition to our ability to be sensitive to and to read and to appropriately respond to other people's emotions, are very fundamental to having successful relationships as human beings. In our second topic, we'll talk about some ethics studies that are really seeking to understand whether or not there are certain emotions that are universal. In order to be considered universal, an emotion has to be based in physiology or biology. It needs to be associated with a distinct facial expression, and it needs to be consistent even when learning is not possible. We'll talk more about some interesting research by a psychologist named Paul Ekman that really used a comparative ethic approach. In our third topic, we're going to talk about how culture influences emotional expression, or what we show on the outside, via what we call display rules. Every culture has different norms and ideas about how much we should show on what's truly going on with us on the inside. Some cultures are much more free and accepting, and they believe in wearing their emotions on their sleeve. Other cultures are much more reserved and refined, and they believe that emotional experiences are private and that they should not be shared with the public or with others. If we look on the right-hand side, we see that there's an illustration of emojis. I'm sure most of us who text use emojis and probably appreciate how important emojis are to conveying feelings in our text messages. Text messages with just words can often be quite boring, and as the old cliche goes, a picture is often worth 1,000 words. So sometimes, again, we might say something with words and then make a certain face to indicate, for example, that that's a joke or whatnot. So to the psychologist, a feeling is based on what is called affect. Affect is based on this idea that we label it cognitively, that we psychologically have this certain feeling going on the inside. Emotions are much more broad than feelings are. They're also based on physiological responses, many of which are automatic responses that we have. So, for example, when we experience the emotion that we call fear, we might have many different feelings that go along with fear, right? We might be nervous, we might be anxious, we might feel on edge. Okay, so these would all be things that we're telling ourselves through our brain that are contributing to this physiological reaction of us having a faster heart rate, starting to hyperventilate, maybe starting to sweat. This is a typical fight or flight response. And these emotions, again, are not necessarily controlled by our conscious mind, but these are things that happen to us automatically, things that our sympathetic nervous system does for us. Psychologists also distinguish between what they call, again, emotional experience. This is what's going on the inside. It's private. Only you know what you're actually feeling on the inside. And the only way that people on the outside world are going to know that is if you either tell them or if you show them in some way through your facial expression or your body language. So expression is really about how much of our physiological reaction that we can show to the world. It's really what we wear on our sleeve. It's what we show to others. Whereas experience is really something that's quite personal. No one else can truly know what it is that you're actually feeling. If you look on the right, you see an example of what's called an fMRI scan. These are recent brain scans. And with all these breakthroughs in technology and neuroscience, we are now understanding about different portions of the brain that are linked to certain kinds of emotions. So, for example, when we have a fear response, our amygdala lights up in our brain. So even though we can't necessarily truly know exactly what you're feeling on the inside, I guess in today's world, if we were to be able to get an fMRI scan of your brain and we saw your amygdala light up, we could definitely make a very strong inference that you were feeling scared, even if you told us otherwise. So how do psychologists measure emotions? There are multiple ways that we measure emotion because, of course, emotions are a multidimensional construct. So if you look on the top left-hand side, if you've ever been to the doctor, maybe a nurse, if you were a child, asked you how you were feeling, how much does it hurt on a scale of 0 to 10. And for kids, we don't want to be just super abstract, so we can make it a little bit more concrete by giving them faces with different kinds of emotional expressions. So obviously the face on the right, which is crying and frowning, is much more intense in its feeling of pain than the face that's on the right, that's green, that is showing a smile. So one way that we can definitely understand and study emotions is just by asking people, asking them to self-report. How are you feeling right now? The second thing that we can do is not ask them for a psychological self-report, but instead to study their physiology. So a psychologist might bring you into the lab, for example, and hook you up with different kinds of probes that could measure things like your heart rate and your blood pressure and your galvanic skin response, which is a measure of how much you're sweating. Okay, the bottom picture represents studies on using a technique that's called facial electromyography. So if you look at the top of the graph, it's called FEMG. And these are studies that specifically look at differences in facial expressions. So for example, if we truly wanted quantitative data about how intensely a person is smiling, we might hook them up to an EMG machine in order to get quantitative data about how much the muscles around the mouth are moving. In fact, later on in this chapter, we're going to learn about research by Jeannie Tsai. And Jeannie Tsai, for example, has found that East Asians in particular smile much more moderately. Westerners and Americans are much more likely to give a big, extreme kind of smile. So studies that use this facial electromyography technique are really great ways for us to understand some of the cultural differences and what we're willing to express and show in terms of our emotion. All right, EQ, or emotional intelligence, involves two components. So in order to be considered of high EQ, you have to score high on each of the two dimensions. So the first two is what's called the first one, is called the intrapersonal dimension. So prefix matter here, right? Intrapersonal EQ involves being aware of what you're feeling. It also involves being able to regulate and control and manage your own emotions. So somebody who's what we considered a hothead would be somebody who scores really low on this dimension. A hothead is somebody who kind of flies off the handle, maybe says things in the heat of the moment that they didn't really mean to say. They show a poor ability to regulate and control their emotions. So when we're really young, it's really about just being aware. What is it that we're feeling? Putting a label on it and being able to understand that we're angry or understand that we're scared. But beyond that, once we are aware of our feelings, we need to know what to do with that feeling. How can we regulate it? How can we control it? Okay, so for many of us on self-quarantine right now, right, we might be aware that we're feeling anxious, or we might be aware that we're feeling afraid. So the next step would be to ask, what are we actively doing to regulate and control our anxiety or to control our fear? And if we're taking active responses, then that usually means that we are going to be scoring higher on this intrapersonal dimension. So intrapersonal EQ is all about you. How good are you at labeling, understanding, managing, and controlling your own emotions? But the second dimension of having strong EQ is about having strong interpersonal EQ. So inter means between, right? It means you and somebody else. So having good interpersonal EQ means, number one, having sensitivity to what other people are feeling, knowing how to read their facial expressions and body language, and understand that even though that somebody might not tell you that they're feeling anxious or that they're feeling angry or that they're feeling sad, that when you're really close to them, that you have this ability to understand and to read some of these very subtle forms of emotional communication and expression. In addition to being able to correctly and accurately label what another person is feeling, Having high interpersonal EQ also involves being able to appropriately react or respond to another's emotions. So if you knew that a friend was feeling sad, for example, offering your friend a hug or telling them that it's going to be okay, these would all be examples of socially and culturally appropriate responses to a friend being sad. It's not considered appropriate, for example, to laugh or to be humorous at a funeral, or when somebody is grieving. Okay, those would be examples of inappropriate ways to respond to a person's grief. So does EQ matter? In the beginning, people thought that EQ was really secondary to IQ. They thought that IQ was really the holy grail in terms of being able to predict things about later life success for a child. But the truth is, most studies show that EQ is extremely important. People who have high EQ, number one, tend to be more successful in their careers, in their marriages, and in their parental relationships. EQ is, in fact, a more powerful predictor of what we would consider overall life success than IQ is. So it's not about being just book smart or cognitively smart, but it's about being socially and emotionally smart. Some interesting research has also been done on gender differences in EQ, and some of these studies show that women tend to score higher on interpersonal messages of EQ. If we go back to what we learned on the chapter on gender and communication, we'll recall that women tend to be high context communicators. They tend to have to read subtle cues about body language and facial expression, and emotions are very important in how females tend to communicate with one another. So I think it probably makes more sense. Men tend to be more low context communicators on average, so they tend to put more emphasis again on the words and are not as versed or as practiced at reading very subtle kind of emotional cues or cries for help. If we look over on the right-hand side, we see a young girl, again, who sees a friend who's sad. She's crying, obviously, by putting her hand to her face, and she's got tears. And notice that the friend is not only aware of the fact that her friend is sad, but that she goes to console her. Consolation and what's appropriate in terms of a form of consolation. These are all things that are shaped by culture. Okay, you'll see that in this particular example, she's offering her friend a hug, which is a form of contact comfort. Whether or not that would be appropriate, of course, would be determined by culture. On the bottom, you see a news clip. I have a video clip that I'm going to share with you in the announcements page that is about a young boy who shaved his head for a friend who had cancer. It's a real tearjerker. And this boy, even though he's very, very young, he displays a huge amount of emotional intelligence. He realized that his friend was going to be scared as he was going through chemo, and he didn't want his friend to be alone when he was going through something scary. So he did a very noble thing. And as his friend went through chemo and lost his hair, he decided he was going to shave his head so that his friend would not be alone. That's beautiful emotional intelligence. Okay, you don't have to be an adult to be emotionally intelligent. Again, there are many children who show high levels of emotional intelligence, and there are probably some adults who lack emotional intelligence. So this isn't just about age or about cognitive maturity. This is about the ability to know how to control and manage yourself, as well as know how to relate to others. In the field of psychology, we also distinguish between what are called basic emotions and self-conscious emotions. So basic emotions are triggered by biologically innate systems in our brain. They again have been crucial to survival and to adaptation. So fear and fight or flight, for example, this is built into our physiology as human beings. When you hear a loud noise or you come into contact with something that is potentially dangerous or threatening to you, you don't have to tell your heart to beat faster or your endocrine system to make your sweat glands produce more perspiration. These are things that automatically and instantly happen. Okay, and they're things that protect us and contribute to survival. Disgust is another example of a basic emotion, again, something that protects us from harm. Disgust is something that is linked to not wanting to eat poisonous food or poisonous berries. So having a discussed reaction as a human is definitely helped us in the course of survival. We're going to find that one of the biggest questions in this research on basic emotions are whether or not basic emotions are universal. We'll discuss what that definition means and discuss the results of some of those studies in a later slide. I also want to talk a little bit about what are called self-conscious emotions. When you are self-conscious of something, you're obviously self-aware. So you have to engage in a form of self-reflection, looking in the mirror at yourself if you're engaging in a self-conscious emotion. So some prime examples of what are considered self-conscious emotions include shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride. These are things that are not linked with the biologically innate physiological response, but these are things that we're taught through the course of socialization, things that are acceptable or unacceptable. A child, for example, who soils his diaper when he's an infant, that's considered acceptable. But when he's still condoning that kind of behavior when he's 5 or 6 years old, he may feel embarrassed, he may feel ashamed. Okay, culture sets certain kinds of standards in terms of what is considered acceptable normal behavior and what is considered unacceptable abnormal behavior. So with shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride, again, those are not inborn instinctual responses. Culture teaches you what to be shameful, guilty, embarrassed, or prideful about. Comparative studies definitely do show that in collectivistic cultures, they rely more heavily on appeals to shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride as a means of keeping the collectivism machine going. So, for example, in collectivistic cultures, shaming the family name is one of the very worst things that you could do. Okay. This also looks at studies that show that this basic idea is present in parental ethnotheories and even in teacher mindsets. So is it okay to use shame, guilt, embarrassment, or appeals to pride when you're trying to motivate a child or a student to quote unquote do the right thing? In Western cultures, we shun teachers who guilt or shame others. Sending a student to a board and making them feel embarrassed that they don't know the answer to the question is considered horrific in a Western classroom. But as we talked about in the earlier chapter, going up to the board when you don't know something is considered an opportunity for a growth mindset in an Asian classroom. And instead of being focused on the individual embarrassment that that child might receive, the collectivistic cultures instead focus on the collective, the holistic, the idea that the class as a whole will be able to learn from the child's mistakes and that it's more about that than it is about causing embarrassment to that particular individual. So in Western cultures, we tend to shun the use of these emotions like shame, guilt, embarrassment, and pride because we believe that they're damaging to the ego. But in collectivistic cultures where the ego does not shine as bright, these are considered acceptable socialization practices. All right, basic emotions. Humans experience hundreds, even thousands of different emotions, but only a few meet the criteria for being considered basic. So in order to be considered basic in psychology, you have to meet 3 different criteria. So number 1, a basic emotion has to have a biologically based reaction. Something that is purely just psychological or psychological is not going to cut it. There needs to be something going on in terms of neurology or physiology in order to be considered a basic emotion. Basic emotions also should be reflected in distinct or specific facial expressions. In other words, smiling is indicative of happiness in Western culture. Smiling should also be indicative of happiness in Eastern cultures. These are not things that should be culturally specific, but rather the idea that the smile is symbolic of an internal happiness experience should be consistent across cultures. Basic emotions should also be considered what we call unlearned, meaning that these are things that are programmed in us genetically. These are a part of our evolutionary survival. Basic emotions are things that should not require observational or social learning. They should not require classical conditioning or operant conditioning. These are things that should be instinctual, things that are a part of our basic biological makeup as human beings because they contribute to survival. So one of the classic sets of studies in this research on basic emotions was conducted by a psychologist named Paul Ekman. He was the first one to really think about this universality question, and he started by using sets of pictures of people displaying different emotional expressions. So on the top left-hand corner here, you see examples from the original study. You see 6 different people displaying 6 different facial expressions. So we have anger, we have fear, we have disgust, surprise. Dave Letterman lookalike here is showing us happiness, and this woman right here is showing us sadness. So according to Paul Ekman's initial research, he found that the only sets of emotions that met all 3 criteria were these 6 basic emotions: anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, and sadness. The first hypothesis that people from different cultures would express the same facial expression when experiencing the same basic emotions was first put forth by Charles Darwin as early as 1872. Ekman's original research was started in the early 70s, and again, those initial studies not only involved cross-cultural comparisons, but he also made comparisons between humans and primates. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you see some examples of some early research that he did with chimpanzees. Okay, and he found that chimpanzees were capable of mimicking these different kinds of facial expressions and responses. Paul Ekman was also, again, famous for making many cross-cultural comparisons. So those initial photos that we saw on the earlier slide, in one of his early comparative studies, he went to a tribe in New Guinea, a tribe that was very non-technological, non-Western, that lived a very agricultural kind of lifestyle. And in the first photo on the top left-hand corner, you see, for example, he asked people to imagine different scenarios that made them happy, that made them angry, that made them disgusted. And Ekman would photograph the people as he asked them to simulate these different emotional experiences. When Ekman compared the photos, he found very strong consistency that happiness, for example, is related to smiling, regardless of whether you're an American or whether you're from New Guinea. Also, this angry face right here, right? This is the face that mom makes at you when you're a kid at the store and you're misbehaving. So those puckered lips, those eyes that could cut through ice, right? The brow, the intensified brow. Okay. We also can find that there are more contemporary studies that have suggested that there's a 7th basic emotion that can be added. And contemporary research suggests that the 7th basic emotion that meets all 3 criteria is called contempt. Okay, I have a video clip that I'll share with you later on. Your textbook author, David Matsumoto, talks about contempt, and he uses an example of a news clip in an interview with Alex Rodriguez. Further evidence for this idea that there are basic emotions and that they're part of our instinctual human programming comes from studies of babies. So studies that examine facial expressions of babies when they're experiencing different kinds of emotions. So for example, when you pull out a baby's favorite toy and he experiences joy, you're going to see a smile. When you take the baby's favorite toy away, you're going to get this face, right? The angry face, the mad face. When you show a baby something new, for example, when we talked about Piaget and did an object permanence task, a young child might show interest or surprise, again, by raising their eyes. Disgust, right? Put something in front of a baby that smells icky. Give them broccoli or asparagus or something that they really don't find appealing. You'll see them close their eyes and pucker their mouth and kind of squish their nose. Okay, if we look at the faces that the babies are making, again, the facial movements in terms of what's happening with the eyes or what's happening with the mouth, what's happening with the brow and the cheek, these are very consistent with the faces that adults make when we are angry or afraid. So again, 7 basic emotions here. Additional evidence comes from research by David Matsumoto, who is again the author of your textbook. So there's a video clip that I will share with you, some studies that he did at the Paralympics. So the Olympics is a wonderful real-world scenario where people who've worked really hard in their sport get a chance to compete. And obviously when you win a gold medal, that's super exciting. You're probably going to experience joy and happiness and excitement. Likewise, losing a contest or a competition can be heartbreaking when you've worked an entire year and given your heart to something. So one of the things that Matsumoto wanted to look at was how would people react to the winning or the losing of a medal? And because in the Paralympics they have opportunities for athletes who are blind to compete, Matsumoto thought that this would be a wonderful comparison. People who've been blind their whole lives have never had an opportunity, for example, to see another person smile or to see another person frown. So Matsumoto believed that he could really add strong scientific evidence to that third criteria, that basic emotions are unlearned. If they truly are part of our instinctual human programming, then no observational learning or classical conditioning or operant conditioning should be necessary. Again, the prediction would be, if that's the case, then regardless of whether an athlete is blind or whether an athlete can see, when they lose their chance at their medal, they're going to feel that same heartbreak and that same sadness. Research on culture and facial expressions definitely show that even though these emotions are universal, the intensity with which we show these things can definitely differ by culture. Okay, this is one of the things that we're going to talk about later, contributes to this idea that it's harder to read subtle emotional cues or facial expressions when you're in an intercultural situation or relationship than it is to read somebody of your own cultural background. Again, there are no rules here for decoding the subtle cues that other people are sending us and their nonverbal forms of communication. So while it might be universal when we show a disgust response to close your eyes and to crinkle your nose and to pucker your mouth, the intensity with which we move our facial muscles can differ. And one of the things that we're going to again find later is that Americans tend to make more extreme facial expressions and East Asians tend to make more subtle facial expressions. So culture also influences the antecedents and appraisal of emotion. Something that is an antecedent is something that comes beforehand. So if we think about a stimulus response relationship, the stimulus is the antecedent and the response is the consequence of what happened beforehand. So one of the things that we've learned is that there are cultural differences in the relative frequency that it takes, in other words, like the threshold level, to bring about a certain kind of emotion. So for example, what does it take to be embarrassed or ashamed? In Western culture, it might not be embarrassing or shameful till you've, for example, failed an exam multiple times. But in East Asian culture, for example, they might have a different threshold for that. So for example, even one bad test or one bad quiz could be a strong enough antecedent event to bring about this response of being embarrassed or ashamed, shaming the family name. To the second bullet point, research also shows that many appraisal processes are universal. So to appraise something means to take inventory of it. It's kind of like answering your own question of what is it that you're feeling right now. So if you, for example, get a pit in your stomach and you label that nervousness versus excitement, the way that you label something can definitely influence the way that you experience and express it. But one of the things that we find is that even though we may appraise something differently, the process itself of asking ourselves, what is it that I'm feeling right now, seems to be universal. What culture does is it influences our threshold. It influences what our hot points or our triggers are in the first place. So for example, what's more heartbreaking? Not being able to play with your friends or not getting an A on a test. Culture indicates what we value, and therefore culture indicates what might trigger us to be happy or prideful or to be embarrassed or to feel guilty or to be ashamed. Culture also teaches us about how to interpret those events, how much we should show of our emotional experience. Should we wear our emotions on our sleeve versus should we keep them personal and to ourselves? Okay, so some cultures, again, for example, when you feel something, you're supposed to express it and to openly show it to the world right away. But other cultures are much more reserved. There's been some interesting research on the authenticity of facial expression. So when somebody is being authentic with you, basically the expression should match the internal experience. So if somebody is smiling at you and they're being authentic, they should be feeling happy on the inside. However, most of us know that in many common social situations, people smile at you for many reasons, only one of which is being happy. So sometimes we smile because we are nervous. Sometimes we smile because it's called for in that particular social situation. So we might give a fake smile or a social smile, like for example, when somebody's taking a picture of us. So there's been some interesting research with facial electromyography and with, again, intimate detailing on photographs that look at the difference between authentic smiles versus what we would consider fake smiles. So if we start over here on the left-hand side, we might look at these two photographs of Julia Roberts, and we might ask which one is the fake smile and which one is the real smile, the authentic smile. So one of the primary differences that we'll see in an authentic smile, or as researchers call this, the Duchenne smile. A Duchenne smile is an authentic smile of happiness. When somebody is truly happy, you'll see a lot of zygomatic movement in these muscles here around the eyes. So in other words, a fake smile is only going to be happening down here. It's only going to be happening at the bottom of the face. Yes, the mouth will turn up in both the fake smile and the real smile, but the key distinction to look at for whether or not a smile is authentic or real is to look at the eyes and the brow area. So you'll see that her eyes are kind of dancing or sparkling here, and you'll see that there's wrinkling or movement in these zygomatic areas. So the right-hand picture is a photograph of Julia in an authentic state of happiness, whereas the left-hand side of the photo is maybe one that's posed, right, where she's asked to say cheese. Okay, over here on the right-hand side, this breaks down the different stages of a Duchenne smile. So as humans, when somebody, for example, makes a joke and we truly and spontaneously are authentically happy during the first stages of our authentic Duchenne reaction, we'll see the mouth turn up, we'll see the teeth come out, you'll see the eyes start to close, okay, or to reduce in size. Okay, and so by the time we get to the point where we're really just cracking up and laughing, not only will we see an intensity of the smile, but look how much the eyes have changed. There's so much more wrinkling of the brow, and the eyes themselves have gotten so much smaller. So when someone's really cracking us up, expect to see those small eyes, wrinkly eyes, and huge tooth present grins. Here's another example of, again, what to look for if you're trying to figure out if somebody's BSing you or being honest with you. Again, don't just look at the mouth. Make sure you're truly looking at the eyes. The eyes are the windows to the soul. So culture definitely influences also what we show to the world, what we express. So there's a lot of studies on what are called cultural display rules. These are both formal and informal social rules about what we should show about our private internal experience. How much should we express and show on the outside? So there are some specific examples that we can look at here. De-amplification is where you express less than you're actually feeling. So for example, to de-amplify means to turn down, whereas to amplify means to turn up, right? So a classic example of de-amplification, let's say you have a coworker that you've kind of been eyeing and hoping is interested in you, you've been flirting with them, right? So maybe they come up and they ask you for a date. If you try to play it cool and act like it's no big deal, then you may be de-amplifying. On the inside, your excitement level may be an 8 or a 9 out of 10, but on the outside, you play it cool like a 4 or 5, and you say, yeah, okay, sure, it'd be fun to hang out. Okay, classic example of de-amplification. Amplifying is where we show or express more on the outside than we're actually experiencing on the inside. Okay, so for example, if somebody tells a joke and you maybe, for example, feel bad for them or you want them to feel as though they're funny, you may laugh harder, okay, than you actually feel on the inside. So maybe on the inside you thought the joke was, a 5 on the funniness scale, but on the outside you hold your belly and you laugh like an 8 or a 9. You turned it up for that person. So to amplify means expression should exceed experience. With de-amplification, it should be the opposite. Expression should be less than our internal experience. A third thing that we might learn in terms of our culture is to show nothing, to basically use what's called this form of neutralization. So people who practice this display rule of neutralization, they don't show you a heck of a lot. When they're happy, they make the same facial expression as when they're sad, as when they're angry, as when they're scared. So people who are very what we might consider apathetic, they stay at the midpoint of the emotional scale. They never get extreme. They never smile. They never cry. They never go to the extremes. They stay at the midpoint. They stay neutral. Another cultural display rule is what we call qualification. So this is when maybe you show emotion, but you kind of cover it up with another emotion on top of it. So for example, if you trip and fall, you might get embarrassed and, for example, blush, okay? But you might also, as you're blushing, make a joke, right? And that humor would kind of be a way of qualifying or distracting from your embarrassment of falling down. So with qualification, you show some of your emotional experience, but you add another emotional expression on top of it to kind of confuse people a little bit. This is related but yet different than what we call masking. So with masking, you're trying to hide completely your feelings from other people. So with qualification, some of your internal emotional experience is authentic and being let out. But with masking, you want zero of your internal emotion experience to let out. So with masking, for example, you may put on the exact opposite emotion. So if you're feeling super sad on the outside, when you mask, you wouldn't let any of that sadness out. You would, in fact, maybe even show the opposite emotion and put a huge smile on your face. The last example is what we call simulation. So to simulate means to pretend, right? An actor, for example, has to simulate crying or being in love when they're cast in a certain TV show or a movie role. So when you simulate it, you show emotion, even though on the inside you feel nothing. So unfortunately, people get hurt in relationships, for example, at times when they start dating somebody and the person that you're dating really doesn't feel an emotional connection, but yet maybe they're quote unquote leading you on by simulating, by acting as though they're in love and acting though as though they're intimate with you, when in fact they feel nothing on the inside. So culture really teaches us about when and where it's appropriate to use these different kinds of cultural display rules. So for example, many Latin cultures follow this idea of kind of it's unhealthy to bottle your emotions up and this idea that you should show your emotions. Females also tend to be of this mindset that it's unhealthy to bottle up your emotions, and they tend to be more comfortable with showing their emotions. Most studies show that men have more difficulty with openly expressing what they're feeling on the inside. So not only might culture influence the display rules for emotional expression, but gender and age, those things can influence that as well. The bottom picture down here is an example of, I think many of us who played sports can relate to this, right? You just lost the game and you're in a really pissy mood right now. You didn't really like the other team, maybe, but yet your coach at the end of the game tells you that you need to go shake hands and you need to high five. So that's a wonderful example of teaching children emotional regulation and the idea that it's not okay to let that anger or that frustration out at that particular moment. That in fact you need to practice, for example, one of these other display rules on the left-hand side rule, and then later on maybe you can go home and you can scream, you can beat up your pillow, you can complain to your best friend. But when sportsmanship, good sportsmanship, is one example of kind of teaching kids that it's not appropriate to have a meltdown in a field, teaching kids that there's a time and a place to express different types of emotions. So I think sports and coaching and parenting are wonderful examples of the way that we socialize and we teach kids about these social display rules. Okay, again, certain cultures believe in low emotion regulation. So if you believe in low emotion regulation, you believe whatever you're feeling immediately, you should express that, you should let that out. Don't think too much, just feel. That's the way to enjoy life and be successful in life. Other cultures are very different. They call for high emotion regulation and control. So these are cultures that, again, regard emotions as private, internal, personal experiences, and they believe that you should show as little as possible to the outside. So with Asian Americans, saving face, for example, is very, very important. So this is a joke over here, obviously, on the right-hand side, the Steven Seagal emotion chart, showing this emotional display rule of neutralization, right? No matter what he's feeling and or experiencing on the inside, his emotional facial expression on the outside is identical. It's the same. So unfortunately, in many intercultural situations, people from East Asian cultures or particular Japanese cultures might be misread for not smiling enough or not making enough eye contact, things that would be considered normal or friendly or personable in Western culture. These are things that are just not common or not practiced often in Japanese culture. So again, not only might the Japanese have different communication styles, as we talked about in the previous chapter, but part of that communication style is based on this high emotion regulation. So again, why not just come out and tell your kids that you love them, as we talked about in the video clips that we watched in class. Um, you don't say I love you directly, but instead you say it in subtle, indirect ways, like have you eaten, right? All right, so Jeannie Tsai. Jeannie Tsai represents some of, I think, what are some of the best contemporary studies of how culture influences emotion and emotional expression. So she's a professor at Stanford University, and I've included a couple of clips for you to watch about her and her research. Let's talk about some of the major things that she's contributed to our understanding of cultural variations in emotional experience and expression. So first of all, I want to talk about her study of how culture experience influences expression. So if you look on the left-hand side, I think this is a classic example of showing this difference in intensity levels of expressing even this basic emotion of happiness. So we see two different emojis, right? And we know from us who use emojis constantly, there are many different types of smiling emojis. So in this one, we have like a, lips turned up, kind of a half smile, whereas in this one we have a big grin, right? We have extremity in terms of our facial movement. The corners of the lip turn up to a much greater degree. We see that here the teeth are visible and here the teeth are not. So I think most of us would agree that this is a higher intensity level smile than this. So Jeannie Tsai's research has shown that Westerners tend to use this style of emotional expression when we're feeling happy on the inside. Eastern cultures, however, tend to wear this face of expression on the outside, even though our intensity level of the inside of happiness might be identical. Again, meaning that an American and an East Asian who are feeling a 9 on a 1 to 10 scale of happiness at the moment, the East Asian may de-amplify, okay, and express through very subtle facial expression much lower level of intensity of happiness compared to the American who's showing outwardly and openly showing this 9 or 10 on the scale. Again, Americans tend to be more high context, direct, and to the point. East Asians tend to be more low context, subtle, beating around the bush. Now, interestingly enough, she's done some studies on, for example, preschooler preferences. So if we ask them, for example, of their favorite faces, East Asian children, for example, pick the left face or emoji as their favorite. American children pick the right face as their favorite. There have even been some interesting studies on storybook characters and looking at the illustrations of storybook characters, and Jeannie Tsai finds consistent differences there as well. So basically what this tells us then is that not only are we generally poor at reading other people's facial expressions to begin with, but when you cross that line across culture, it makes it increasingly difficult. So in research, there's definitely an in-group advantage in terms of reading other people's emotions. We tend to read the emotions of our in-group much more accurately than we read the emotions of an out-group. So again, in an intercultural situation, say a job interview or a conversation between a typical American and a typical East Asian, again, the levels of eye contact and smiling. The Westerner may feel that the East Asian didn't like them or wasn't friendly because they didn't make eye contact during the interview or smile much during the interview. And while that might be considered normal or appropriate behavior for a Western culture, in Eastern culture, it's not appropriate to smile. It's not as appropriate to make as much distinct eye contact. And unless we understand and are educated and know that about each other, it's easy to have a misunderstanding and to think, well, gee, that person was really unfriendly, or gee, that person really didn't like me. So basically, research shows that the only exception to this rule is with basic emotions. So yes, we understand that a smile is indicative of happiness, and whether or not that smile is a full teeth grin versus a mild upward grin, we still understand that smiling is indicative of happiness. So the basic exception to this in-group advantage rule is with basic emotions. But for all other emotions, we definitely are much more accurate in deciphering and decoding the emotions of members of our own group than members of other groups. Finally, Jeannie Asai has also shown that there are some cultural differences in what she considers what we call quote-unquote ideal affect. So ideal affect represents, if we ask people, what is the emotion that you would like to experience most often? What is the ideal emotional state for you? So in a perfect world, what emotion would you be experiencing the most? And one of the things that she finds that's pretty consistent in her research is that Westerners, or those from individualistic cultures, tend to identify their ideal emotional state with things that are associated with high physiological arousal, things that are exciting. Okay, so Westerners, for example, talk about feeling elated and excited and euphoric and enthusiastic. People in East Asian contexts, however, generally prefer things that are less physiologically arousing. So they'll identify their ideal affective state as being, for example, relaxed, calm, peaceful, serene, okay? Kind of at a very different bar than what we see with the Westerners. And what's interestingly enough is that these studies show that it's not only observed in studies of adults, but even if we study children as early as age 3 and 5, and we make cross-cultural comparisons, or if we study college students, or if we study seniors, okay, would we find these differences in cultural differences in ideal affect? And Jeannie Tsai and her colleagues have built up a pretty impressive body of research showing that it really doesn't matter how old we are or what generation that we're from, but that these cultural differences in our ideal affective state are pretty consistent across cultures and across age groups. Another set of studies that I think are kind of creative and interesting are studies of social media accounts. So those of you who are on Facebook a lot or on Instagram a lot, take a look at your feed and see if you notice this. She, for example, suggests that the social media profiles of many East Asians tend to focus, number one, on events that are calm and serene. And later on, we're going to, or if we connect what we learned in the previous chapter of cognition, we notice that many East Asians post photos of themselves in a context. So the ratio of background to the person is much more proportional. It's again holistic. It's the person in context. So the left-hand side is an example of both the cognitive and kind of the emotional profile that we might predict with somebody who holds East Asian collectivistic kind of backgrounds, right? And values. You don't make yourself stand out from the crowd. You are part of a whole. Your ideal affect is something that's on calmness and sereneness. On the right-hand side in Jeannie Tsai's studies, this is a wonderful example of what we might find in a typical American's profile. So in America, we're all about individualism. We're all about individuating and making ourselves stand out from the crowd. So if you look at the profile of many Westerners or Americans, we tend to pick profile pictures that show us doing really off the wall or risky or kind of amazing, unusual things. If we also look at the proportion, we'll find that Americans tend to include more of themselves in the photo. There's less of the background. Americans are more, again, independently oriented and focused on the self. So our profile pictures tend to have a higher proportion of photos of ourselves rather than images of the background. So being exciting, showing this ideal, again, euphoric, enthusiastic kind of lifestyle is something that allows us to achieve the values of our culture of individualism, to make ourselves unique and to make ourselves stand out from the crowd. But in collectivistic cultures, the values are the opposite, right? The nail that sticks out gets pounded down. So instead of making yourself stick out, you make yourself blend in. And so we should see this in the social media profile. Again, not only looking at the proportion of the person to the background, but also looking at whether or not we're promoting this sense of calmness and sereneness versus a sense of excitement and uniqueness. Okay, so culture definitely influences how we feel about these different emotions. Jeannie Tsai's research definitely shows that there are cultural differences in our ideal affective state, but there's not as many cultural differences in terms of how we actually feel. So while cultural differences in ideal affect may be strong in terms of magnitude, differences in actual affect are relatively weak in comparison. We believe that temperament and personality are the stronger predictors of how we're actually feeling, whereas culture tells us what is, again, what is appropriate, what is ideal.